Imagine a world not of serene temples and gentle cherry blossoms, but of shadowy empires built on a brutal code of fear and respect. A nation within a nation operating boldly in plain sight. Its influence seeping into the very foundations of a country struggling to rise from the atomic ashes of war. This was the reality not of a fictional thriller, but of post-war Japan. A reality meticulously crafted and ruthlessly commanded by one man, a kingpin so powerful he commanded a silent army of tens of thousands, a man who transformed a fractured collection of feudal gangs and street thugs into a corporate style multinational criminal syndicate with revenues that rivaled legitimate corporations. His name was Kazuo Taoka, and he would become the undisputed Godfather, the shogun of the underworld, the man known as the last emperor of the Yakuza. What you are about to hear is the true, unvarnished, and detailed story of his brutal ascent from utter obscurity, his tyrannical and absolute reign, and the dramatic, inevitable downfall that would follow, a saga that forever redefined the very architecture and ambition of organized crime in the 20th century. But before we descend into this intricate and often dark labyrinth of ultimate power and profound violence, it is my duty to offer you a crucial and sincere disclaimer. This entire narrative, spanning decades of complex history, has been meticulously pieced together from a vast multitude of sources: declassified government records, historical archives, court trial transcripts, biographies written by crime journalists, and countless pieces of investigative journalism. Our sole purpose here is to present to you, the listener, the most accurate, comprehensive, and structured account possible to educate and to inform, and to provide a clear window into a hidden world, not to glorify or sensationalize the severe criminal acts and the profound human suffering you will hear described. This is a story of real, tangible consequences, of lives shattered, of a nation's fabric tested, and of a legacy written in blood and ink. So, if you are ready to step into these shadows, to understand the complex man behind the formidable myth, then I invite you to listen closely, to settle in, and to allow this story to unfold. This is the epic of Kazuo Taoka and your immersive journey into the secretive, brutal, and fascinating heart of the Yamaguchi-gumi begins at this very moment. The story of an emperor always begins not in a palace, but in the grit and struggle of profound hardship. And for Kazuo Taoka, this was the absolute, unvarnished truth. He entered the world on a spring day, March 28, 1913, in the rural and relatively poor island prefecture of Kagawa on Shikoku, a place far removed from the future neon, lit urban jungles of Kobe and Osaka that he would one day come to rule as his personal fiefdom. His early life was a brutal and unforgiving lesson in loss, instability, and emotional deprivation. His father, whose presence could have provided some anchor, died when Kazuo was just a small boy, leaving a void that would never be filled. Then came an even more profound abandonment. His mother, overwhelmed by poverty and the struggles of single parenthood, found a new partner and made the devastating decision to leave her young son behind, effectively abandoning him entirely. This act of maternal desertion would become the central, defining trauma of his life, forging in him a deep-seated anger and a desperate, lifelong need for a different kind of family, a different kind of iron-clad loyalty that could not be so easily broken. He was shipped off to be raised by relatives, but he was a wild, unmanageable, and fiercely independent child, his temper explosive and his defiance towards any form of authority absolute. The structured, disciplined world of school held no interest for him. It felt like a prison compared to the chaotic and immediate freedom of the streets, where a boy's worth was measured by his strength and cunning, not by his grades. He found his real education not in dusty textbooks, but in the harsh, unforgiving classrooms of the docks and the back alleys, learning instinctively how to fight, to steal, to intimidate, and to dominate. By the time he was a teenager, the writing was on the wall. At the age of 16, filled with a burning resentment and a restless ambition for something more than his rural confines could ever offer, he made the decisive break. He fled Kagawa and, like countless young men seeking their fortune, he made his way to the sprawling, bustling, and notoriously tough port city of Kobe, a metropolis whose very air was thick with the scent of the sea, opportunity, and clandestine power. A city that would soon become the stage upon which his legendary life would play out. The Kobe that young Kazuo Taoka entered in the late 1920s was a city of stark contrasts and raw opportunity, a bustling, noisy, and often brutal maritime gateway where the legitimate commerce of ships and cargo seamlessly blended with the illicit economies of smuggling, gambling, and extortion that thrived in its shadowy corners. It was a world governed by a different set of rules, a world where strength was currency and respect was earned through fear or favor. And for a hardened, fatherless, and fiercely ambitious 16-year-old with nothing to his name but a volatile temper and a will to survive, it was the perfect proving ground. His first years, there were a relentless struggle for existence, a hand-to-mouth existence where he took any back-breaking work he could find, primarily as a laborer on the very docks that defined the city's economy. He worked among stevedores and ruffians, men who were as tough as the cargo they handled, and it was here, in the grime and sweat of the waterfront, that his natural propensity for violence and his innate leadership qualities began to surface. He was not just another strong back, he was a strategic brawler, someone who understood that a fight was won not just by throwing the hardest punch, but by projecting an aura of invincibility, by breaking the opponent's spirit before the first blow was even landed. It was this reputation that inevitably drew the attention of the local criminal element, specifically a man named Noboru Yamaguchi, who was at that time a rising and ambitious lieutenant within a sizable local gang known as the Yamaguchi-gumi, which was then led by the founding boss, Harukichi Yamaguchi. The young Taoka, with his raw physical power, his utter fearlessness, and his clear, unyielding loyalty to those he deemed worthy, was exactly the kind of enforcer such an organization needed to expand its territory and intimidate its rivals. His official induction into the Yamaguchi-gumi was not a formal ceremony in those early days, but a gradual process of being given small, increasingly dangerous tasks, collecting debts from reluctant businessmen, protecting gambling dens from rival incursions, serving as a formidable bodyguard for higher ranking members. With each successful mission, his stature within the group grew. He was not merely a hired thug. He was a believer in the gang's potential, and he saw in this structured, hierarchical world of the Yakuza the family he had never had, a brotherhood bound by a strict code of jingi, or duty and humanity, a concept that emphasized loyalty, obligation, and a twisted sense of chivalry. This code, with its rituals of finger, cutting yubitsumi as penalty for failure, and its full body tattoos, irazumi, as marks of commitment, provided the structure and belonging his chaotic childhood had so profoundly lacked. He gave himself to the Yamaguchi-gumi completely, and the gang, in turn, began to shape itself around his formidable presence. His rise through the ranks was meteoric, fueled by a combination of sheer brutality and a shrewd, tactical mind that bosses like Harukichi Yamaguchi and his right-hand man, Noboru, quickly recognized and valued. He was the perfect weapon, but a thinking weapon, one who could assess a situation not just for its immediate violent potential, but for its long-term strategic advantage. This period of his life was his true apprenticeship, a brutal education in the mechanics of power, the nuances of territorial control, and the complex politics of the Japanese underworld. He learned how to run a gambling operation with ruthless efficiency, how to mediate disputes between other gangsters with an iron fist, and, most importantly, he began to build his own network of loyal followers, men who were personally devoted to him, to Taoka the leader, as much as they were to the Yamaguchi-gumi as an organization. This creation of a personal power base within the larger structure was a critical step, one that would define his future path. By the time the winds of war began to swirl across the Pacific in the late 1930s, Kazuo Taoka was no longer the anonymous runaway from Kagawa. He was a recognized and feared name in Kobe's underworld, a key soldier in a growing criminal army, poised and ready for the chaos that a world war would inevitably unleash, a chaos that he would masterfully exploit to cement his own power and propel the Yamaguchi-gumi onto a trajectory that would ultimately make it the largest and most powerful criminal syndicate the world had ever seen. The outbreak of World War II and Japan's subsequent militarization created a paradoxical environment for the underworld. On one hand, the state exerted immense pressure for total conformity and national service, but on the other, the chaos of a war economy, rampant shortages, and a police force distracted by larger geopolitical concerns created fertile ground for illicit enterprises to not only survive, but to profoundly thrive. For Kazuo Taoka and the Yamaguchi-gumi, this period was a crucible that tested their resilience and ingenuity, ultimately forging them into a more sophisticated and deeply entrenched organization. Like many able-bodied men, Taoka was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army, an experience that, while brief, would further discipline his mind and harden his spirit to the realities of institutionalized violence and large-scale command structures. His military service was cut short, however, by a severe case of beriberi, an illness resulting from malnutrition, which led to his discharge and return to Kobe in 1943. He came back to a city that was changing rapidly under the duress of total war, a city where the official economy was crumbling and the black market was becoming the primary means of survival for its citizens. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The Yamaguchi-gumi, under boss Harukichi Yamaguchi, had already begun to pivot, leveraging its network of ports, trucks, and enforcers to control the flow of coveted goods, food, medicine, fuel, and construction materials that were nearly impossible to obtain through legal means. Taoka, with his enhanced reputation and now veteran status, threw himself into this new enterprise with ferocious intensity. He was no longer just a street-level enforcer. He became a master black marketeer, a logistical genius of illegality who understood supply chains and demand dynamics. He organized complex operations to siphon off military supplies, orchestrated the smuggling of rice and other staples from the countryside, and established a ruthless monopoly over key commodities in Kobe's starving neighborhoods. This was not mere gangsterism. It was a shadow governance, and in a time of desperate need, the Yamaguchi-gumi, under the de facto field command of men like Taoka, became a necessary evil for many, a source of survival that bred a twisted form of loyalty and fear among the populace. This era also saw a significant shift in the internal hierarchy of the gang. The aging founder, Harukichi Yamaguchi, began to rely more and more on his most capable lieutenants, and among them, Taoka's star shone the brightest, his ability to generate immense revenue, to manage complex operations under the constant threat of military police crackdowns, and to violently eliminate any rival groups trying to muscle in on their territory, made him indispensable. The war, with its firebombing campaigns, reached a terrifying crescendo for Kobe as well, culminating in the Great Kobe Air Raid of 1945, which reduced much of the city to smoldering ruins. Yet, even this catastrophe was converted into an opportunity by Taoka and the Yamaguchi-gumi. Amid the ashes and the societal collapse that followed Japan's surrender, the gang positioned itself as a primary force in the reconstruction efforts, controlling the supply of scarce building materials and labor, and further infiltrating the unions that would rebuild the city. This period immediately after the war, under the American occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur, was the true genesis of the modern Yakuza. The occupying forces focused on demilitarizing Japan and rebuilding its political institutions, had little bandwidth to tackle the deeply entrenched criminal networks that were now flourishing in the economic desperation. It was in this power vacuum, in the lawless landscape of a defeated and occupied nation, that Kazuo Taoka truly came into his own, demonstrating a vision that extended far beyond the traditional scope of a gang boss. He began to see the Yamaguchi-gumi not just as a criminal gang, but as a corporation, a quasi-political entity that could wield influence over every aspect of economic and social life in post-war Japan. The stage was set. The old world had been burned away, and from its ashes, a new emperor was ready to rise and build his empire. An empire that would be constructed not on the principles of democracy and peace, but on the timeless currencies of fear, profit, and an unbreakable, fanatical loyalty. The end of World War II did not bring peace to the Japanese underworld. Instead, it unleashed a frenzied and violent struggle for supremacy as countless gangs, large and small, fought to carve out their pieces of the new, impoverished Japan. It was in this chaotic and bloody landscape that Kazuo Taoka's legend would be forged in fire and steel. A period defined by a series of ruthless power plays and audacious expansions that would see him rise from a powerful lieutenant to the undisputed sovereign of the Yamaguchi-gumi. The pivotal moment arrived in 1946 with the death of the gang's founding kumiko, or family head, Harukichi Yamaguchi. His passing created a power vacuum that threatened to shatter the organization he had built. The natural successor, by tradition and expectation, was Noboru Yamaguchi, the founder's adopted son and Taoka's own mentor. However, in a move that sent shockwaves through the entire Kansai underworld, Noboru Yamaguchi made a decision that was both shocking and strategically brilliant. He declined the leadership, recognizing the volatile, post-war environment required a leader of unparalleled ferocity, tactical genius, and iron will. Qualities he saw in abundance in his protégé. Noboru effectively anointed Kazuo Taoka as the new boss. This was not a peaceful transition. It was a coronation backed by the implicit threat of Taoka's own formidable power base and his reputation for utter ruthlessness. Many older, more traditional members opposed this move, viewing the outsider from Kagawa as unworthy of the Yamaguchi name. Their opposition was short-lived. Taoka moved with lightning speed and overwhelming force to consolidate his power, systematically neutralizing, exiling, or eliminating any internal dissent. He was not merely taking over a gang. He was executing a hostile takeover of a criminal corporation, and he made it clear that loyalty to him was now absolute and non-negotiable. His formal inauguration as the third kumiko of the Yamaguchi-gumi marked the beginning of a new, terrifying era. He immediately instituted a regime of strict discipline and military-like organization, transforming the once somewhat sonsan coalition of street gangs into a tightly knit, hierarchical paramilitary force. He understood that to achieve his grand vision, he needed more than just thugs. He needed managers, accountants, and lawyers. He began to professionalize the syndicate's operations, creating specialized divisions for its core businesses. A gambling division that ran sophisticated card games and pachinko parlors. A construction division that used strong, armed tactics to control public works projects. A finance division that ran loan, sharking operations, and an enforcement division, his personal army, which was responsible for territorial defense and, when necessary, offensive campaigns. Taoka's ambition, however, stretched far beyond the city limits of Kobe. He envisioned a nationwide syndicate, a network that could dominate organized crime across all of Japan. To achieve this, he embarked on a strategy of relentless expansion, a campaign of violent corporate growth known as shinogi. He would target smaller, independent gangs in Osaka, Kyoto, and beyond presenting them with a simple, brutal ultimatum: be absorbed into the Yamaguchi-gumi and enjoy the protection and profits of the larger family, or be annihilated. Those who resisted were met with overwhelming and merciless force. Gang headquarters were firebombed, rival bosses were assassinated in broad daylight, and street wars erupted that turned city districts into combat zones. Taoka himself was often on the front lines, leading his troops and solidifying his image as a fearless warrior king. His most famous weapon in these conflicts was not a gun or a sword, but a military grade wooden sword, which he wielded with devastating effect, a symbolic and very real instrument of his personal power. Through this combination of strategic brilliance, bureaucratic reorganization, and sheer, unadulterated terror, the Yamaguchi-gumi grew at an exponential rate. By the early 1950s, it was no longer just a dominant Kobe gang. It was the most powerful criminal organization in Western Japan, a colossus whose influence reached into every port, every construction site, and every entertainment district. Kazuo Taoka, the abandoned orphan, now sat atop a throne built on a mountain of yen and a river of blood, his authority absolute, his command unchallenged. He had become the Kumiko, and the world, both above and below ground, was now forced to reckon with the formidable presence of the man they would soon call the Yakuza's last emperor. With his internal authority cemented and his external rivals either subjugated or obliterated, Kazuo Taoka entered the 1950s and 60s not merely as a gang boss, but as the chief executive of a vast, multifaceted, and increasingly sophisticated criminal conglomerate. This was the golden age of his reign, an era where the Yamaguchi-gumi transformed from a dominant regional syndicate into a truly national and even international powerhouse, its tendrils weaving deep into the legitimate and illegitimate economies of a Japan experiencing its own economic miracle. Taoka's genius lay in his ability to modernize the ancient codes of the Yakuza, marrying the traditional rituals of jingi with the cold, efficient logic of a post-war corporation. He established a clear, hierarchical corporate structure for the syndicate, complete with a main headquarters in Kobe that functioned as his central office, from which he directed a sprawling network of hundreds of subsidiary gangs, known as kumi-in, each with its own designated territory and business portfolio, all paying a portion of their earnings upward to the central treasury in a system resembling corporate dividends. He held regular executive meetings with his top lieutenants, men like Hiroshi Yamamoto and Masaru Takumi, who acted as his board of directors, where strategies were formulated, disputes were adjudicated, and resources were allocated with the formality of a Fortune 500 company. Under his leadership, the Yamaguchi-gumi's portfolio diversified dramatically, while traditional rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and protection remained lucrative staples. Taoka aggressively moved into industries booming from Japan's reconstruction and rapid economic growth. The construction industry became a primary target. The Yamaguchi-gumi used its muscle to infiltrate and control major public works projects, from highways and dams to the infrastructure for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, ensuring that subcontractors were their own and that lucrative contracts flowed through their hands. The entertainment industry was another key frontier. They established a stranglehold on the pachinko industry, a gray zone business that was a perfect vehicle for money laundering and muscled their way into film production, talent agencies, and the bustling nightlife districts of major cities, extracting protection money from bars, clubs, and restaurants. Taoka also pioneered the Yakuza's deep involvement in jaya, or real estate racketeering. His soldiers would target landowners in areas slated for development, using tactics of relentless harassment, intimidation, and even violence to force them to sell their property at a fraction of its value, it which the syndicate would then resell to developers for an enormous profit, effectively holding the entire urban development process hostage. This expansion was not without its bloody costs. However, the drive for national dominance inevitably led to the most violent and defining conflict of Taoka's career, the war with the rival Yamaguchi-gumi, a split-off faction that became a bitter enemy. This was not a street rumble. It was a protracted, nationwide gang war that stretched over years, featuring assassinations, bombings, and open gun battles in city streets that shocked the public and drew unprecedented police attention. It was during this war that Taoka's reputation for invincibility was both solidified and nearly shattered. He survived multiple assassination attempts, the most famous being a point-blank shooting in a public bathhouse that he miraculously survived, an event that was whispered about in the underworld as proof of his supernatural toughness. Yet, through it all, his control never wavered. He managed his empire with an iron will, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing any transgression with severe, traditional penalties. Yet he also rewarded competence and success generously, fostering a culture of fierce devotion among his inner circle. By the late 1960s, the Yamaguchi-gumi, under Taoka's meticulous and brutal guidance, had achieved a level of power and influence that was unprecedented in the history of organized crime. It was estimated to have tens of thousands of direct and affiliated members. Its annual revenue was in the billions of dollars, and its influence reached into the highest levels of politics and business. Kazuo Taoka was no longer just a criminal. He was an institution, a shadow shogun whose decree could move markets, sway elections, and dictate the fate of thousands. He had built his empire, and now, from his throne in Kobe, he ruled over it with absolute authority, the undisputed last emperor, presiding over the most powerful criminal dynasty the world had ever seen. Behind the formidable public persona of the ruthless Kamicho, the man who commanded an army of criminals and wielded power over life and death, existed a complex and deeply personal world that was, in many ways, the hidden engine of his reign. To understand the full architecture of Kazuo Taoka's power, one must venture into the private sphere, a domain dominated by one of the most remarkable and formidable figures in the annals of organized crime, his wife, Fumiko Taoka. If Kazuo was the emperor of the Yamaguchi-gumi, then Fumiko was its empress, a woman whose intelligence, ambition, and political acumen were every bit the equal of her husband's brutal strength. Their union was far from a simple marriage. It was a strategic merger, a partnership that became the central pillar of the syndicate's stability and longevity. Fumiko was not a passive Yakuza wife, content to manage the household. She was, in effect, the syndicate's chief administrative officer, its chief diplomat, and its emotional core. She possessed a sharp mind for business and an uncanny ability to manage the complex, often volatile, personalities within the gang's upper echelons. While Kazuo was the fearsome symbol of ultimate authority, the one who issued commands that could not be questioned, Fumiko was the one who often managed the day-to-day politics, smoothing over disputes between lieutenants, advising on strategic alliances, and acting as a trusted intermediary when her husband's direct involvement was too intimidating or too heavy-handed. She was the hostess of the Taoka home, which also served as the de facto Yamaguchi-gumi headquarters, where she would entertain and carefully assess high-ranking members, potential allies, and even politicians, her keen eyes and ears gathering intelligence that was invaluable to her husband's decision-making. Her influence extended into the very culture of the organization. She was a staunch traditionalist who insisted on the strict observance of Yakuza rituals and codes of conduct, understanding that this discipline was what separated them from common street thugs and gave their criminal enterprise a sense of honor and purpose. This dynamic, however, was not without its profound personal costs, which were most tragically embodied in the life of their only son, Masashi. From the moment of his birth, Masashi was thrust into a world of immense pressure and expectation, groomed from childhood to be the crown prince, the heir to a vast criminal empire. He was raised in a gilded cage, surrounded by bodyguards and the constant, looming shadow of his father's legendary reputation. Kazuo, hardened by his own brutal upbringing, was a distant and demanding father, expecting his son to embody the same toughness and strategic brilliance that had defined his own rise. Masashi, however, was a different temperament. He struggled under the weight of this inheritance, showing more interest in the arts and literature than in the brutal realities of gang leadership. This created a deep and painful rift between father and son, a source of private anguish for Kazuo, who could command the loyalty of thousands of hardened men, but could not connect with his own child. Fumiko often found herself in the impossible position of mediator between the two, trying to bridge the chasm between her husband's uncompromising expectations and her son's sensitive nature. The tragedy of the Taoka family was a microcosm of the larger contradictions of the Yakuza life, a world that preached family above all else, yet often destroyed the very families it was meant to protect. Despite this personal turmoil, the partnership between Kazuo and Fumiko remained the bedrock of the syndicate. She was his most trusted confidante, the one person in the world who could speak to him with absolute candor and whose counsel he respected above all others. In a world where trust was a fatal vulnerability, their bond was unshakable. When Kazuo was in prison, which happened several times throughout his career, it was Fumiko who effectively steered the ship, relaying his orders, managing finances, and ensuring that the organization remained cohesive and loyal in his absence. Her strength during these periods cemented her legendary status within the underworld. She was not merely the boss's wife, she was a leader in her own right. This intricate private life, with its blend of deep partnership and profound personal tragedy, completes the portrait of Kazuo Taoka. He was not a one-dimensional monster, but a man of immense contradictions, a figure of terrifying public violence and rigid control, who relied utterly on the private strength and wisdom of his wife, and who harbored a deep, unspoken pain over his fractured relationship with his son. It was this combination of the iron-fisted Kumiko and the complex family man that fueled the Yamaguchi-gumi's golden age, a period of unprecedented power that seemed, for a time, as if it would last forever, an eternal dynasty built on a foundation of blood, loyalty, and the unbreakable will of an emperor and his empress, the seemingly unassailable fortress of the Yamaguchi-gumi, built over decades of blood and strategic calculation, could not forever remain immune to the shifting tides of the society it both exploited and inhabited. The zenith of Kazuo Taoka's power in the late 1960s and early 1970s also marked the beginning of its gradual, yet inexorable, decline, a downturn triggered not by a single catastrophic event, but by a convergence of powerful external forces that began to systematically dismantle the environment which had allowed the Yakuza to operate with such brazen impunity. For years, the relationship between the police and the syndicates had been a complex, often symbiotic dance of tacit understanding and periodic, performative crackdowns. However, the sheer scale and visibility of the Yamaguchi-gumi, particularly the brutal and public violence of its war with the Matsuda-gumi, finally forced the hand of the authorities. The Japanese public, growing more affluent and less tolerant of the lawlessness that had characterized the post-war years, began to demand a more aggressive stance. This public pressure catalyzed a new, hardened approach from the National Police Agency, which shifted its strategy from one of containment to one of outright eradication. The first major blow was not a bullet or a bomb, but a piece of legislation. The 1970s saw the introduction and rigorous enforcement of new, stringent anti-Yakuza laws, specifically designed to cripple their financial infrastructure. These laws targeted the syndicate's lifeblood, their revenue streams. Police began to apply relentless pressure on the businesses that formed the backbone of the Yamaguchi-gumi's income, systematically shutting down their illegal gambling rings, disrupting their pachinko money, laundering operations, and prosecuting the Jiajiya real estate rackets with a new vigor. This financial squeeze was a strategic masterstroke. It did not immediately target Taoka himself, but it began to starve his organization of the capital. It needed to sustain its vast network of soldiers and payoffs. The second, and perhaps more damaging, front in this new war was the court of public opinion, a series of high-profile scandals and incidents, often splashed across the front pages of newly aggressive tabloid newspapers and magazines, began to erode the Yakuza's carefully cultivated, if mythical, image as honorable outlaws who protected the common people, the reality of their violence, the innocent bystanders caught in crossfire, the small business owners driven to bankruptcy and suicide by their extortionate tactics, the political corruption scandals that exposed their deep ties to the highest levels of government, was laid bare for the entire nation to see. This media exposure was devastating. It turned the public firmly against them, transforming the Yakuza from folkloric figures into despised social parasites. This shift had a direct and tangible impact. Businesses that had once paid mekajimario, or protection money, out of fear, now felt emboldened to refuse, knowing that public sentiment and police action were on their side. Furthermore, Japan's rapid economic modernization and globalization in the 1970s and 80s began to create a world that was less hospitable to the Yamaguchi-gumi's traditional methods. The economy was becoming more digital, more international, and more regulated, making large-scale cash-based criminal enterprises increasingly difficult to hide. The international connections that Taoka had once cultivated as a sign of his power now became a liability, as Interpol and other global law enforcement agencies began to share intelligence and coordinate efforts against transnational organized crime. The Yamaguchi-gumi, for all its corporate structure, was fundamentally a creature of a specific time and place, post-war, cash-rich, physically intimidating Japan. The new Japan was a different country, one that was increasingly unwilling to tolerate a shadow government operating within its borders. Kazuo Taoka, now entering his later years, found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts that he was not fully equipped to win. The battles were no longer in the back alleys of Kobe against rival gangsters he could intimidate or eliminate. They were in courtrooms, in legislative chambers, on the financial pages of newspapers, and in the minds of the Japanese public. The emperor, who had built his empire through direct, overwhelming force, was now facing an enemy that was diffuse, bureaucratic, and ideological. The very foundations of his power were being chipped away, not by a rival Kumiko, but by the relentless, impersonal march of a modernizing society that had finally decided it no longer had a place for him. The sun that had shone so brightly on his golden age was now beginning to set, casting long shadows over the empire he had spent his entire life building. As the external walls of his empire faced an unprecedented siege from a newly determined society, the internal foundations, once thought to be as solid as granite, began to show their own subtle, yet profound, cracks. The decline of Kazuo Taoka's Yamaguchi-gumi was not merely a story of police crackdowns and new laws. It was also a deeply human story of aging, succession anxiety, and the inevitable decay of a system built entirely around the cult of a single, irreplaceable personality. Taoka himself, the indomitable force who had survived assassinations and gang wars, was now succumbing to a foe against which he had no defense time. Advancing age brought with it a host of health problems, including a severe stroke that significantly impaired his ability to lead with the same ferocious, hands-on intensity that had defined his reign. This physical decline created a power vacuum at the very heart of the syndicate, a vacuum that his subordinates, despite their oaths of loyalty, began to eye with a mixture of ambition and trepidation. The strict, pyramid-like hierarchy that he had so meticulously constructed, which had been the source of the organization's strength, now became its greatest vulnerability in his absence. Without his iron will to hold the top in place, the layers below began to shift and grind against one another as senior lieutenants who had long operated under his absolute authority now jockeyed for position and influence in anticipation of a future without him. This internal friction was exacerbated by the changing nature of the Yakuza recruits. The new generation entering the syndicate in the 1970s and 80s was different from the hardened post-war veterans who had built the organization. They were often less disciplined, less bound by the traditional codes of jingi, and more motivated by quick profit and flashy lifestyles than by any sense of feudal loyalty to the family name. This generational divide created a cultural schism within the ranks. The old guard viewed the new recruits as disrespectful and unreliable, while the younger members saw the elders as outdated and out of touch with the new realities of crime in a modern Japan. This erosion of the traditional Yakuza ethos made the organization more volatile and harder to control, leading to unsanctioned violence and reckless behavior that further drew the ire of the police and the public. Compounding this internal strife was the ever-present, agonizing question of succession, a question that was both a political crisis and a source of deep personal anguish for Taoka. His only son and designated heir, Masashi, had proven to be a profound disappointment in the eyes of the old guard. Sensitive, intellectual, and seemingly lacking the ruthless temperament required to command an army of criminals, Masashi was viewed as weak and ill-suited for the throne. The pressure on him was immense and unrelenting, and it became painfully clear to his father and the senior leadership that Masashi could not be the one to steady the ship in the coming storm. This forced Taoka and his inner circle, particularly the formidable Fumiko, to look elsewhere for a successor, a process that itself sowed seeds of discord and rivalry among the top-ranking lieutenants, each believing themselves to be the most worthy. The syndicate, which had once moved with the unified purpose of a single organism, was now fracturing into competing factions, its internal cohesion dissolving just when it needed unity the most. Furthermore, Taoka's own legendary reputation began to work against him. For decades, his name alone had been a deterrent, a symbol of invincible power. But as he grew older and more infirm, that symbol began to lose its potency. Rival syndicates, once cowed into submission, began to test the boundaries, encroaching on Yamaguchi-gumi territory and challenging its dominance in key industries. The fear that had been the cornerstone of his control was fading, replaced by a calculating assessment of his vulnerability. The emperor was becoming a figurehead, and the vassals were beginning to stir. This period of internal decay was a slow, insidious poison, far more dangerous than any external threat. The police could be bribed, intimidated, or outmaneuvered. New laws could be circumvented with clever accounting and shell companies. but the loss of discipline. The generational rift, the bitter struggle for succession, and the fading power of the leader's persona were cancers from within, eating away at the soul of the organization. Kazuo Taoka, from his sickbed, could only watch as the empire he had built with his own 2 hands and a will of steel began to slowly, inexorably, crumble around him, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet, heartbreaking sound of shifting loyalties and dying traditions. The final curtain on the life of Kazuo Taoka, the last emperor, began to descend not on a battlefield or in a hail of gunfire, as might have been fitting for a man of his violent legend, but in the quiet, clinical confines of a hospital room, a setting that stood in stark, ironic contrast to the tumultuous and blood-soaked decades of his reign, the once indestructible force of nature, who had wielded a wooden sword with terrifying effect and stared down death on multiple occasions, was finally brought low by the cumulative toll of a life lived at an unsustainable intensity. His health, which had been in a slow but steady decline for years, deteriorated sharply following a severe stroke, an event that left him physically diminished and largely removed from the day-to-day command of his vast criminal domain. The final years of his life were a protracted and somber twilight, a period where he was more a symbol than an active ruler. His authority maintained through the fierce loyalty of his inner circle and the still, potent fear his name invoked, even as the man himself faded. From his sickbed, he was kept apprised of the syndicate's affairs, with Fumiko and his most trusted lieutenants acting as the conduits for his waning will. But the dynamic, hands-on leadership that had defined the Yamaguchi-gumi's golden age was gone, replaced by a regency of sorts that struggled to manage the escalating external pressures and the simmering internal discontent. The empire was on autopilot, and it was heading into increasingly stormy seas. It was during this period of his incapacitation that the full weight of the new anti-Yakuza laws and the relentless police pressure began to be felt in a way that was truly crippling. Recruitment plummeted as the Yakuza lifestyle lost its romanticized allure and became a social and professional death sentence, with banks denying services and businesses refusing to deal with known members. Revenue streams that had once flowed like mighty rivers were reduced to a trickle, forcing the organization to make difficult choices and cut off support to less profitable factions, which only fueled more internal resentment. The world that Kazuo Taoka had mastered was vanishing, replaced by a new, less forgiving order that had no place for his kind of grandiose, public criminality. Then, on July 23, 1981, the news that had been anticipated yet still sent seismic shocks through every corner of Japan, from the highest political offices to the darkest criminal underworld, was finally announced. Kazuo Taoka was dead. He was 68 years old. His death from heart failure marked the end of an era, a definitive full stop on a chapter of Japanese history that had been written in the shadowy ink of organized crime. His funeral was a spectacle of contradictory forces, a testament to his complex legacy. It was a massive, lavish affair, attended by thousands of Yakuza from across the nation. all paying their final respects to the man who had been their undisputed king. They came, these hardened men, many with tears in their eyes, their bodies adorned with the intricate tattoos that signified their lifelong commitment to the code he had embodied. Yet simultaneously, the event was swarmed by an army of journalists and monitored intently by a heavy police presence, symbolizing the society that was now determined to consign his world to the history books. The passing of the emperor immediately triggered the succession crisis that had been looming for years. With his own son, Masashi, deemed unsuitable for the immense burden of leadership, the mantle fell not to a single dominant figure who could command universal respect, but to a compromise candidate, Masaharu Takenaka, a senior lieutenant whose ascent was immediately and violently contested by other powerful factions within the syndicate. Taoka's death did not bring peace. It unleashed the very chaos his iron-fisted rule had kept at bay for so long. The carefully maintained unity of the Yamaguchi-gumi shattered almost overnight, splintering into warring factions that would soon plunge the organization into a bloody and self-destructive civil war known as the Yama-ichi War, a conflict that would claim hundreds of lives and further decimate the syndicate's power and prestige. The man who had built the empire through force of will was gone, and without his centripetal force, the empire immediately began to tear itself apart. The death of Kazuo Taoka was not just the death of a man. It was the death of a certain idea of the Yakuza, the end of the age of the Godfathers who ruled as absolute monarchs. In his final, quiet breaths in that Kobe hospital, an entire epoch of Japanese organized crime drew to a close, leaving behind a fractured, weakened, and besieged organization to face a future for which it was profoundly unprepared. A future where the long shadow of the last emperor would be both a haunting memory and a standard that no one could ever hope to meet again. The vacuum of power left by the death of an absolute monarch is almost always filled not with orderly transition, but with the thunder of conflict, and the passing of Kazuo Taoka proved to be no exception to this brutal historical rule. The carefully maintained stability of the Yamaguchi-gumi, which had for decades been enforced by Taoka's sheer will and the terrifying finality of his judgments, evaporated the moment his heart stopped beating, giving way almost immediately to a period of internal carnage so violent and destructive that it would forever be known as one of the bloodiest chapters in the annals of Japanese organized crime, the Yama-ichi War. This was not a war against an external rival, but a fratricidal conflict, a civil war that pitted brother against brother, lieutenant against lieutenant, in a savage struggle for the soul and the throne of the now leaderless empire. The formal appointment of Masaharu Takenaka as the fourth Kumiko was intended as a stabilizing move, a compromise to prevent the organization from fracturing, but it instead acted as the spark that ignited the powder keg of ambition and resentment that had been building for years. A powerful and influential faction led by Hiroshi Yamamoto, a senior boss who commanded immense loyalty from a large segment of the syndicate, refused to acknowledge Takenaka's authority, believing himself to be the rightful and more capable successor. What followed was a descent into a lawless hellscape that played out on the streets of Japan's major cities. The conflict was characterized by a level of brutality that shocked even the most hardened Yakuza veterans. It was a war fought with machine guns and hand grenades in broad daylight, a shocking departure from the more controlled, almost ritualistic violence of the past. Car bombs became a common tactic, detonating outside rival offices and in busy entertainment districts, killing not only intended targets, but also maiming and terrifying innocent civilians, thereby eroding the last vestiges of public tolerance. Assassination squads composed of young, ruthless gunmen with little regard for the old codes hunted each other with a ferocity that bordered on fanaticism. The streets of Kobe, Osaka, and Tokyo became battlegrounds, with daytime shootouts and nighttime arson attacks becoming almost commonplace. The war was not confined to the foot soldiers. It was a decapitation strategy. High-ranking bosses on both sides were systematically targeted for elimination, their homes and offices attacked, their families living in constant fear. The conflict exposed a fundamental shift in the Yakuza psyche. The traditional notions of honor and loyalty to the overarching family had completely collapsed, replaced by a raw, naked struggle for power and survival. This internal bloodletting could not have come at a worse time for the Yamaguchi-gumi, for it provided the perfect pretext for the authorities, who had been waiting for such an opportunity, to move in with overwhelming force. The police, who had been meticulously building cases and gathering intelligence for years, now had a very public and very bloody reason to launch an all-out offensive. They raided headquarters, arrested hundreds of members on both sides of the conflict, and seized vast caches of illegal weapons and financial records. The public, horrified by the daily news reports of gangland murders and bombings, overwhelmingly supported this crackdown, giving the government a powerful mandate to destroy the syndicates once and for all. The Yamaguchi War, which raged for years and claimed well over 100 lives, including that of the newly installed Kumiko Masaharu Tekanaka himself, who was assassinated in 1985, did what no external enemy, no police force, and no law had been able to do during Taoka's lifetime. It shattered the Yamaguchi-gumi from within. It drained the organization's financial resources, decimated its leadership ranks, and shattered the myth of its invincibility and unity. The mighty colossus that Taoka had built was now a bleeding, fractured entity. Its various factions more interested in destroying each other than in facing the common enemy of the state. The war was the direct and inevitable consequence of a system built entirely around one man's indomitable personality. Without that central, unifying force, the entire structure collapsed into chaotic, self-destructive anarchy. It was the final, tragic act of Kazuo Taoka's legacy, a brutal demonstration that the empire could not survive its emperor, and that the methods he had used to build his power, violence, intimidation, and absolute authority, were the very same forces that would, in his absence, ensure its spectacular and bloody downfall. In the smoldering aftermath of the Yama, Ichi War. The Yamaguchi-gumi that emerged was a profoundly altered entity, a phantom of its former self. Forced to adapt to a new century that held none of the permissiveness or opportunity of the post-war era that had been its cradle. The Civil War had inflicted wounds from which the syndicate would never fully recover, shattering its monolithic unity and scattering its power among feuding factions, some of which would break away to form their own independent and often hostile syndicates. The long, painful process of rebuilding began under a succession of leaders who lacked the legendary stature of Kazuo Taoka, men who ruled over a fractured kingdom and who faced a world increasingly arrayed against their very existence. The Japanese government, emboldened by public outrage over the gang war, enacted ever more draconian laws designed not just to inconvenience the Yakuza, but to systematically dismantle them as functioning entities. The 1992 anti-Boryokudan law was a watershed moment, legally defining and specifically targeting designated crime syndicates, making it a crime for them to demand mekajimurio or to engage in traditional racketeering, and empowering prefectures to issue injunctions against their activities. This was followed in 2010 by the even more devastating anti-organized crime laws, which criminalized the payment of funds to Yakuza groups, effectively making it illegal for any business, from a multinational corporation to a small ramen shop, to do business with them, cutting them off from the legitimate economy in an unprecedented way. The Yamaguchi-gumi was forced to adapt its very structure to survive, retreating further into the shadows, becoming more decentralized and relying on complex networks of front companies and shell corporations to launder money and hide its assets. The flamboyant, publicly known gangsters of Taoka's era, with their office buildings and business cards, were replaced by a new generation that operated with far more discretion, their identities concealed, their operations more digital and financially sophisticated. Yet, even as it adapted, the syndicate could not escape the ghost of its founder. The name, Taoka, remained a powerful symbol, a touchstone of a more powerful and respected past. And the leadership that followed often invoked his legacy to legitimize their own authority, even as they presided over a much diminished organization. The internal strife did not end with the Yamaguchi War. Decades later, in 2015, the Yamaguchi-gumi would undergo another, even larger schism, splitting into two major warring factions in a conflict that echoed the destructive patterns of the past, proving that the centrifugal forces unleashed by Taoka's death were a permanent feature of the organization's landscape. Throughout the 21st century, the syndicate's membership numbers, which had once been in the tens of thousands, began a steady and dramatic decline as the lifestyle became financially untenable and socially ostracizing. The iconic full body tattoos, once a badge of honor, became a mark that made it impossible to get a job, rent an apartment, or even enter a public bathhouse. The world had systematically walled them out. The legacy of Kazuo Taoka is therefore a deeply paradoxical one. He was the architect of the Yamaguchi-gumi's golden age, the visionary who transformed it into a global criminal powerhouse, a figure whose influence on the structure and ambition of organized crime is immeasurable. Yet, he was also, unwittingly, the architect of its eventual decline. The system he built was so personalized, so dependent on his own unique combination of charisma, intelligence, and ruthlessness, that it could not be sustained without him. The very tools he used to achieve dominance, absolute authority, a cult of personality, and the ruthless elimination of rivals, created a culture of dependency and internecine violence that doomed the empire to fracture in his absence. He left behind an organization that was immensely powerful but inherently unstable, a colossus with feet of clay. The Yamaguchi-gumi of today is a shadowy, fragmented remnant, a testament to his monumental success in building an empire, and an equally monumental testament to his failure to build an institution that could transcend the lifespan of its founder. The long shadow of the last emperor still falls upon the Japanese underworld, but it is now the shadow of a ruin, a haunting memory of a time when a single man could command a nation within a nation, a time that the relentless march of history and law has ensured will never come again. To view Kazuo Taoka solely through the lens of his criminal enterprises and the body count of his reign is to miss the profound and enduring complexity of the man, a figure who existed at the volatile intersection of profound personal trauma, a desperate search for belonging, and a ruthless will to power that would reshape the world around him. The abandoned boy from Kagawa never truly vanished. He was the hidden engine that drove the formidable Kumiko, the raw, unhealed wound that fueled a lifetime of relentless ambition and a near pathological insistence on absolute loyalty. His entire life can be interpreted as a colossal, decades-long reaction to that initial, primal betrayal by his mother, a desperate and violent attempt to construct a family that could not, by its own sworn codes, ever abandon him. The Yamaguchi-gumi, with its rigid hierarchy, its rituals of blood brotherhood, and its unwavering demand for fealty, became the ultimate surrogate family, a structure that provided the order and belonging his childhood had so catastrophically lacked. This psychological drive explains the ferocity with which he defended the organization and the utter finality with which he punished any perceived disloyalty. To betray the syndicate was to reenact the abandonment of his mother, an unforgivable sin that merited only eradication. This inner world of deep, seated insecurity and yearning also illuminates the seemingly contradictory aspects of his personality. He could be merciless, ordering the torture and execution of rivals with cold detachment. Yet he was also capable of immense, almost feudal generosity towards his loyal soldiers and their families, ensuring they were cared for in times of need because their well-being was synonymous with the health of his chosen family. He demanded unwavering respect and formality, yet he was known to be a man of simple, almost austere personal tastes, who found solace not in lavish displays of wealth, but in the unadorned exercise of power. This complex psychology also casts the tragedy of his relationship with his son, Masashi, in an even more poignant light. The father who had built a criminal empire to create an unshakable family structure, found himself unable to connect with his own flesh and blood. A sensitive young man who recoiled from the very violence that was the foundation of his father's world. In his son's intellectual pursuits and gentle demeanor, Taoka likely saw not just a weak hair, but a profound personal rejection, a failure to pass on the very values that he believed had saved him from oblivion. This private failure stood in stark contrast to his public image, which was carefully cultivated into a near mythological status. In the underworld, and to a fascinated public, he became the Godfather, the last emperor, a larger-than-life figure whose legend was woven from a tapestry of fact and embellished rumor. Stories of his almost supernatural toughness, like surviving a point-blank shooting, were told and retold as proof of his invincibility. His preference for a wooden sword over a firearm became a symbol of his old school honor and personal bravery. He was depicted as a man of his word, a ruler who governed by a strict, albeit brutal, code, a characterization that allowed some segments of society to romanticize him as a necessary evil, a dark knight who maintained a twisted form of order in the chaotic post-war landscape. This mythology was crucial to his power. It intimidated rivals, inspired fanatical loyalty in his followers, and created an aura of inevitability around his rule. He was not just a gangster, he was an archetype, the embodiment of a certain kind of Japanese strength and tradition, even as he ruthlessly exploited a modernizing nation. Understanding this intricate interplay between the wounded child and the ruthless emperor, the private man and the public myth, is essential to grasping the full dimensions of Kazuo Taoka. He was a paradox, a man who preached family while failing his own, a traditionalist who revolutionized crime, a brutal thug who displayed strategic genius, a king who ruled from the shadows. His story is not just a chronicle of criminal events. It is a Shakespearean drama of power, loss, and the inescapable ghosts of the past, a testament to the fact that the most formidable empires are often built not on grand ideological designs, but on the fractured foundations of a single, deeply human, and profoundly damaged soul. While Kazuo Taoka's empire was fundamentally and quintessentially Japanese, rooted in the specific cultural and historical soil of post-war Kobe, his ambitions and the sheer scale of the organization he built inevitably projected his influence onto the global stage, placing him in a unique and formidable position within the international pantheon of 20th century crime lords. In an era when other notorious underworld figures like Lucky Luciano in America or Pablo Escobar in Colombia were building their own empires on narcotics, Taoka and the Yamaguchi-gumi under his command charted a distinctly different course, one that was both a strategic choice and a reflection of their cultural identity. For decades, the Yamaguchi-gumi adhered to a strict, self-imposed prohibition on drug trafficking, particularly the sale of amphetamines and heroin to the Japanese public, viewing it as a dishonorable and destructive practice that brought unwanted police scrutiny and eroded the social fabric of their own nation. This policy, which was fiercely enforced by Taoka, allowed the syndicate to maintain a somewhat paradoxical moral high ground, enabling them to cultivate an image as honorable outlaws who preyed on the weaknesses of businesses and the gambling instincts of adults, but not on the addiction of the masses. This is not to say the organization was uninvolved in the global illicit economy. On the contrary, their mastery of the Japanese ports, particularly Kobe, made them indispensable partners for international criminal networks seeking to move product. Whether it was firearms from Southeast Asia, stolen art and antiquities from Europe, or eventually, despite the official ban, narcotics in transit to other markets. Taoka's syndicate became a premier logistics and service provider for global crime, offering protection, safe passage and money laundering services for a fee, thereby profiting from the drug trade without directly dirtying their hands in retail sales within Japan. This strategic positioning allowed the Yamaguchi-gumi to accumulate immense wealth and forge powerful alliances with Chinese triads, Korean gangs, and the American mafia, all while maintaining a veneer of traditional honor. Taoka himself became a symbol of this transnational power, a figure respected and feared by crime lords across the world, who saw in his corporatized, disciplined syndicate a model of criminal enterprise that was potentially more sustainable than the flashier, more volatile cartels of the Americas. His empire was a testament to the fact that global criminal dominance did not necessarily require controlling the source of a narcotic, but rather controlling the channels of trade and finance. The Yamaguchi-gumi under Taoka was less like a drug cartel and more like a shadowy, violent multinational corporation specializing in illicit services and territorial monopoly. This global footprint, however, also made the syndicate a target for international law enforcement agencies like the FBI and Interpol, who began to see the connections between the flow of illegal goods into the United States and the sophisticated networks operating out of Japanese ports. The legend of Taoka, therefore, grew not just in the back alleys of Osaka, but in the briefing rooms of police forces from Washington to Paris. He was the enigmatic Japanese godfather who had built an impregnable fortress, a man who understood the mechanics of global capitalism as well as any CEO, and who applied them to his criminal endeavors with brutal efficiency. His legacy in the global underworld is a complex one. He was both a traditionalist, clinging to a code that forbade the most profitable of criminal enterprises, and a visionary who saw the future of transnational organized crime as a matter of logistics, finance, and corporate structure. He demonstrated that an organization could achieve global reach and immense power without its name becoming synonymous with a single commodity like cocaine or heroin. In this, he was arguably ahead of his time, presaging the modern era of organized crime, where fluid networks and financial sophistication often trump territorial control and sheer firepower. The Yamaguchi-gumi was his masterpiece, a criminal leviathan that was as much a part of the globalized post-war economy as any legitimate Japanese multinational, and Kazuo Taoka was its visionary, if ruthless, chairman of the board, a man whose influence extended far beyond the shores of his island nation, casting a long, sophisticated, and deeply intimidating shadow across the entire criminal world. The empire of Kazuo Taoka was not built on persuasion or economic leverage alone. It was forged, cemented, and ultimately defined by the calculated and theatrical application of violence, which served as the primary language of his power and the ultimate enforcement mechanism of his will. For Taoka, violence was never mere mindless brutality. It was a precise tool, a form of communication with its own grammar and syntax, deployed with a specific strategic purpose in mind. It was a language that everyone, from the lowest street vendor to the highest ranking politician, could understand without the need for translation. The philosophy underpinning this was a stark, Darwinian logic. The display of overwhelming force was the most efficient way to establish dominance, to deter challengers, and to maintain internal discipline within an organization comprised of thousands of hardened criminals. This was not the random violence of a street brawl. It was institutionalized, systematic, and often ritualized. The most iconic example was the traditional Yakuza practice of yubitsu, or the partial amputation of the little finger as a penance for failure or disloyalty. Under Taoka, this practice was enforced with unwavering consistency. It was a brutal, yet non-lethal, form of punishment that served multiple purposes. It physically branded the offender as someone who had erred. It functionally weakened his grip on a sword or a gun, thereby making him more dependent on the organization. And it served as a constant, visible reminder to all other members of the severe cost of failing the family. But beyond these internal rituals, the public face of Taoka's violence was even more terrifying. When a rival gang refused to be absorbed into the Yamaguchi-gumi, the response was not a negotiation. It was an annihilation. Gang offices were firebombed in the dead of night, sending a plume of smoke and a message of terror across the city. Rival bosses were not just killed, they were often executed in spectacularly brutal fashion, their bodies left in public places as a grim warning to others who might consider defiance. Taoka himself was a practitioner of this violent theater, famously leading raids with a military-grade wooden sword, a weapon that was both archaic and deeply personal. Using a sword, even a wooden one, required getting close to one's enemy, looking them in the eye, and personally delivering the blow. This was a world away from the impersonal pull of a trigger from a distance. It was an intimate, terrifying act of domination that cemented his reputation as a warrior, king who was not afraid to get his hands dirty. This reputation for personal ferocity was a crucial part of his mythos, inspiring a mixture of terror and awe that kept potential rivals in check. However, the most strategically sophisticated aspect of Taoka's use of violence was its scalability. It could be dialed up or down depending on the situation. For a small business owner behind on protection payments, the first warning might be a broken window. If that failed, it could escalate to a severe beating. And if resistance continued, it could end in murder or the destruction of the business itself. This created a predictable and terrifying cost-benefit analysis for anyone who considered crossing the syndicate. The message was clear: compliance is inexpensive, resistance is catastrophic. This ecosystem of fear allowed the Yamaguchi-gumi to control vast swaths of territory and industry with a surprisingly small number of actual enforcers. The threat of violence did most of the work for them. People policed themselves out of fear of what the Yamaguchi-gumi might do. This system, while brutally effective in the short term, also contained the seeds of its own long-term destruction. The very public and gruesome nature of this violence, particularly during the gang wars, eventually turned the public and the authorities firmly against them. The image of the honorable outlaw was shattered by the reality of car bombs and mutilated bodies. The state, which had once turned a blind eye, was forced to respond with its own form of overwhelming force in the shape of new laws and police crackdowns. The violence that had built the empire ultimately became the primary reason for its siege and decline. Yet, for the duration of his reign, Kazuo Taoka's mastery of this dark art was absolute. He understood that in the absence of legal authority, only the currency of fear could sustain a shadow government. He was a grand master of intimidation, a conductor of terror, who orchestrated a symphony of violence that for decades kept a nation in thrall, proving that sometimes the most powerful word is not spoken at all, but is delivered at the end of a fist, a sword, or the barrel of a gun. The sheer scale and brazenness of the Yamaguchi-gumi's operations under Kazuo Taoka's leadership would have been impossible to sustain for over 3 decades without a complex and deeply embedded work of complicity that reached into the highest echelons of politics, of Japanese politics, law enforcement, and corporate life. Taoka's empire did not exist in a vacuum oppositional to the state. Rather, it functioned as a dark, symbiotic partner to it, a shadowy counterpart to the public, facing institutions of post-war Japan, each feeding off the other in a carefully balanced, if unspoken, relationship. This was not a simple matter of bribing a few low-level police officers. It was a sophisticated system of mutual back, scratching, and strategic alliances that ensured the syndicate's survival and growth. On a political level, the Yamaguchi-gumi became a powerful, if deniable, political tool for certain factions within the long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. During elections, the syndicate's formidable grassroots network could be deployed to guarantee outcomes in key districts. Yakuza enforcers, operating as campaign volunteers, would intimidate opposition candidates and their supporters, stuff ballot boxes, and pressure local businesses to fall in line, delivering blocks of reliable votes for the LDP candidate who, in return, would ensure that anti-Yakuza legislation remained toothless, or that lucrative public works contracts found their way to construction companies controlled by the syndicate. This relationship provided the Yamaguchi-gumi with a layer of political insulation that was as valuable as any army of bodyguards. Within the business world, the ties were even more extensive and financially rewarding. The period of Japan's rapid economic growth, the so-called economic miracle, was a golden opportunity for the Yamaguchi-gumi, and Taoka positioned his organization as a silent partner in the nation's rebuilding. Major construction companies, seeking to avoid costly delays from labor disputes or community opposition, would quietly pay the syndicate to ensure smooth operations on large-scale projects like highways, dams, and the infrastructure for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. The Yamaguchi-gumi controlled key construction unions and could, with a single phone call, either guarantee a trouble-free worksite or unleash a wave of strikes and accidents if their demands were not met. This practice, known as yami shikin, or shadow funding, made the syndicate an unofficial and immensely powerful arbiter of the construction industry. Furthermore, the relationship with the Kaise, or the corporate world, extended into the realm of shareholder meetings. The Yamaguchi-gumi perfected the art of sokaya, corporate extortion, through the acquisition of company shares. They would attend shareholder meetings and either threaten to reveal embarrassing corporate secrets or disrupt the proceedings with loud and aggressive behavior unless they were paid off quietly. So pervasive was this practice that nearly every major corporation in Japan had a budget line for these payoffs, viewing it as a simple cost of doing business. For Taoka, these relationships with politicians and corporate leaders were a masterstroke. They legitimized his organization in the eyes of a certain pragmatic segment of the establishment, integrated his financial interests directly into the heart of the Japanese economy, and created a powerful class of stakeholders who had a vested interest in the continued existence of the Yamaguchi-gumi. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a power broker, a fixer, a man whose influence could make or break political careers and corporate fortunes. This system of institutional corruption was so effective that for years, the police and the media often turned a blind eye, treating the Yakuza as a necessary, if unpleasant, part of the social fabric. It was only when the syndicate's internal violence, particularly the Yamaguchi War, spilled out so publicly that it could no longer be ignored, that this delicate balance was shattered. The ensuing public outrage forced politicians to sever their ties and empowered a new generation of prosecutors and police commanders to finally take action. But for the majority of Kazuo Taoka's reign, this intricate web of complicity was the true bedrock of his power. The invisible architecture that supported the visible empire of violence and intimidation. It demonstrated Taoka's profound understanding of a fundamental truth, that in the modern world, true power is not wielded from the shadows alone, but in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms where politics, business, and crime seamlessly converge. The formidable and fearsome reality of Kazuo Taoka's reign did not exist in a cultural vacuum. It was simultaneously reflected, distorted, and often romanticized by the burgeoning Japanese media and entertainment industry, creating a complex and enduring cultural mythology that continues to shape the public's perception of the Yakuza to this day. Throughout the peak of his power, Taoka himself was a figure of intense media fascination, a shadowy celebrity whose every move was chronicled by a press corps that oscillated between fear and fawning admiration. The Yakuza films, or Ninkyo Eigas, chivalry films that exploded in popularity during the 1960s and 70s, did not merely tell stories about gangsters They created a powerful and seductive narrative archetype that was directly inspired by, and in turn helped to burnish, the legend of men like Taoka. In these films, the Yakuza were not portrayed as vicious criminals, but as tragic, honorable outlaws, giri, ninja figures, trapped between their duty to the gang and their innate human compassion. They were depicted as men of their word, bound by a strict code, who fought with swords and fists out of a sense of obligation, not mere greed. This cinematic portrayal, while a dramatic oversimplification of the brutal reality, was powerfully influential. It provided a framework for the public to understand and even secretly admire figures like Taoka, casting them as modern-day samurai operating in a corrupt world, a narrative that the real-life Yakuza were all too happy to encourage. Taoka himself understood the power of this image and carefully cultivated an aura of traditional authority and quiet dignity that fit the cinematic mold. His refusal to be photographed smiling, his austere lifestyle, and his insistence on formal dress and ritual all contributed to this mythos. The media, in turn, reported on his activities with a mixture of trepidation and reverence, detailing his legal troubles, the gang wars, and even his health scares with the same gravity afforded to a head of state. This created a feedback loop. The films romanticized the reality, and the reality, as embodied by Taoka, seemed to validate the films. Beyond cinema, the Yakuza aesthetic, the head-shaven supakon or convict-style haircut, the dark sunglasses, the sharp suits, and the full body tattoos became deeply embedded in Japanese popular culture, influencing fashion, music, and even video games. This cultural absorption had a profound effect. It normalized the presence of the Yakuza, making them seem like an inevitable, almost folkloric, part of the national landscape. For the young and disaffected, this glamorized image was a powerful recruitment tool, offering a vision of a life filled with purpose, brotherhood, and rebellious glamour, far removed from the soul, crushing conformity of the salaryman's existence. However, this romanticized narrative always existed in a state of tense contradiction with the grim reality. While the films showed stylized sword fights, the real Yamaguchi-gumi was using shotguns and car bombs. While the screen Yakuza protected the weak, the real Yakuza extorted money from small shopkeepers and drove them to suicide. This dissonance began to widen dramatically in the 1970s and 80s as investigative journalists started publishing exposés that peeled back the glossy veneer, revealing the organization's deep involvement in drug trafficking despite its public ban, and its corrosive corruption of politics and business. The public's fascination began to curdle into disgust, especially as the violent internal wars of the 1980s made it impossible to ignore the carnage. The cultural portrayal began to shift as well, with a new genre of films, the jitsuroku or documented record films, emerging. These were grittier, more violent, and less romantic, depicting the Yakuza not as noble outlaws, but as vicious, avaricious thugs. The legend of Kazuo Taoka, therefore, exists at the center of this cultural tug of war. He was both the real-life godfather who inspired a genre of romantic fiction, and the brutal warlord whose actions ultimately helped dismantle that very fiction. His story demonstrates the immense power of narrative, showing how a criminal organization can, for a time, wield cultural influence as potent as any political or financial power, crafting an image that serves as both a shield against public outrage and a magnet for new recruits. But it also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of that power, proving that when the myth becomes too detached from reality, the eventual collision can be devastating, shattering the carefully constructed image and leaving behind only the ugly, unvarnished truth. Beyond the ledger books of illicit profit, the political machinations, and the cinematic mythology, the reign of Kazuo Taoka was, at its core, a human tragedy of immense and often unrecorded proportions. A story written not in the annals of power, but in the silent suffering of countless ordinary lives chaffered by the casual brutality of his organization. For every headline about a rival boss assassinated or a corporate shakedown, there were 100 untold stories of quiet despair, of families broken, of businesses destroyed, and of a social fabric torn by the pervasive fear that the Yamaguchi-gumi injected into the communities it claimed to control. The small shopkeeper running a modest ramen shop or a pachinko parlor was the true economic lifeblood of the syndicate, and for them, the arrival of a Yakuza enforcer was not a scene from a movie. It was a waking nightmare that could spell the end of everything they had worked a lifetime to build. The demand for Makajimario, the protection money, was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum delivered with a chilling smile and an unspoken threat of violence. For those who resisted, the consequences were swift and merciless. Windows would be smashed, delivery trucks would be vandalized, and loyal customers would be intimidated away. If resistance continued, the owner might be dragged into a back alley and savagely beaten, sometimes in front of their family. A lesson in terror designed to resonate throughout the entire business district. The psychological toll was immense, creating a climate of silent complicity where neighbors were afraid to speak out, and victims felt they had nowhere to turn, knowing the police were often powerless or, worse, complicit. This systemic extortion drove many into bankruptcy and, in the most tragic cases, to suicide. Seeing it as the only escape from the unrelenting pressure and the shame of being unable to protect their livelihood, the human cost extended far beyond the world of commerce. The Yamaguchi-gumi's foray into real estate racketeering, the jiajaya business, ruined the lives of countless families who found themselves targeted for their land. Elderly couples who had lived in their homes for generations were subjected to campaigns of psychological warfare. Midnight phone calls, dead animals left on their doorsteps, human waste smeared on their walls, all designed to break their spirit and force them to sell their property for a pittance. These were not criminals or rivals. They were ordinary citizens whose only crime was owning a piece of land that the syndicate coveted. The gang's control over the construction industry also had a devastating human cost, as they infiltrated labor unions and suppressed wages, enforced dangerous working conditions, and silenced any dissent with threats and violence. all while siphoning off millions from public works projects that were paid for by taxpayer money. And then there were the innocent bystanders, the collateral damage of the gang wars that Taoka waged with such ferocity, the car bombs and street shootouts that were intended for rival gangsters did not discriminate. They maimed and killed delivery boys, office workers, and mothers walking their children home from school. Their lives snuffed out in an instant to serve the ambitions of a criminal empire. Each of these acts of violence sent ripples of trauma through families and communities, creating a legacy of pain that lasted for generations. The wives and children of Yakuza members themselves lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth, but also by constant fear. Fear of their husband's or father's arrest, fear of retaliation from rivals, fear of the very organization that provided for them. The code of silence, the omerta of the Yakuza world, ensured that this ocean of human suffering remained largely invisible, a silent scream swallowed by the noisy narrative of power and profit. To truly understand the legacy of Kazuo Taoka, one must look beyond the legend of the Godfather and bear witness to this vast landscape of quiet ruin. His empire was not just a criminal organization. It was a machine for producing human misery, a system that fed on the fear and desperation of the very society it parasitically inhabited. The towering figure of the last emperor, for all his strategic brilliance and personal discipline, was built upon a foundation of countless small, forgotten tragedies, a somber reminder that the true cost of organized crime is never measured in yen or dollars, but in the broken lives and stolen futures of the innocent. The long shadow cast by Kazuo Taoka stretches far beyond the bloody conclusion of the Yamaguchi War and his own physical demise, a spectral presence that continues to define the identity, struggles, and very nature of the Yamaguchi-gumi and organized crime in Japan to this present day. The organization that exists now in the second decade of the 21st century is a ghost of its former self, a fractured and besieged entity that nonetheless remains the largest Yakuza syndicate, a testament to the formidable foundation Taoka laid, even as it contorts itself to survive in a world that has become increasingly hostile to its very existence. The successors who followed him, from the ill-fated Masaharu Tekenaka to the various leaders who navigated the subsequent schisms, have all ruled in the long shadow of the third Kumiko, their authority perpetually measured against the gold standard of his reign and inevitably found wanting. The most profound and damaging legacy of his rule was the structural flaw he bequeathed to the organization. A system so centralized and personalized that it could not withstand the absence of a single dominant leader. This inherent instability has manifested in a seemingly endless cycle of fragmentation and internal conflict, most notably the massive schism of 2015 when the Yamaguchi-gumi splintered, giving birth to the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi and later the Ninkyo Yamaguchi-gumi, a division that has led to yet another protracted and costly gang war, echoing the self-destructive patterns of the past. This perpetual state of internal warfare has been a gift to the authorities, who have used the public violence as justification for enacting ever more stringent laws, like the 2010 ordinances that criminalized paying the Yakuza, effectively forcing them out of the legitimate economy and making it nearly impossible for them to bank, rent offices, or even purchase mobile phones. The iconic Yakuza image, once a symbol of fearsome power, has become a social and professional death sentence, with businesses publicly posting Yakuza exclusion ordinances and bathhouses refusing entry to tattooed patrons. Membership, which once numbered in the tens of thousands, has plummeted to a fraction of its former size, as the lifestyle offers little but poverty and pariah status. The old codes of honor and loyalty have largely evaporated, replaced by a desperate scramble for survival. Yet, despite this dramatic decline, the name Yamaguchi-gumi still carries weight, and the name Taoka is still spoken with a mixture of fear and respect within the underworld. The syndicate has been forced to adapt, becoming more virtual and decentralized, operating through complex networks of front companies and relying more on cybercrime and financial fraud than on traditional strong arm tactics. They are a dimmer, more discreet version of Taoka's bold and public empire, but they endure. This endurance is perhaps Taoka's most complex legacy. He created a brand, a corporate identity for crime, so powerful that it has managed to survive the death of its founder, the ravages of civil war, and the full force of the modern state. He demonstrated that organized crime could be structured like a multinational corporation, a model that has been adopted by criminal groups worldwide. His life story remains the ultimate Yakuza parable, a rags to riches epic that continues to inspire a certain kind of rebellious, doomed romanticism, even as the reality of that life has become increasingly grim and unsustainable. The Yamaguchi-gumi today is a living monument to Kazuo Taoka, but it is a ruin, a crumbling castle whose foundations he laid with unparalleled vision, but whose walls are now being steadily worn away by the relentless tides of time, law, and a society that has finally, decisively rejected it. His legacy is thus a paradox of enduring influence and spectacular failure. He built an empire that would bear his name for decades, but he also planted the seeds of its inevitable disintegration, creating a system that was too rigid, too personal, and too violent to ever outlive its creator. The last emperor rules now only in memory, a towering figure from a bygone era, watching as the kingdom he built with such brutal determination slowly, inexorably turns to dust, to distill the sprawling, violent, and profoundly consequential life of Kazuo Taoka into a single, coherent meaning is to attempt to capture a torrent in a teacup, for his story is not one, but a multitude of stories, a complex tapestry woven from threads of profound personal trauma, ruthless ambition, strategic genius, and a deep, paradoxical yearning for a familial order that his very actions constantly undermined. He was, in the final analysis, a man of his specific time and place, a product of the chaotic, opportunity-rich ashes of post-war Japan, and it is difficult to imagine his particular brand of empire building succeeding in any other era. He was the right man, with the right mix of damage and drive, at the absolutely right moment in history. The abandoned boy from Kagawa found in the lawless landscape of a defeated nation the perfect canvas upon which to project his immense will to power. And he painted upon it with the darkest pigments of violence and intimidation. The lesson of his ascent is an ancient and brutal one, that in the absence of strong, legitimate institutions, power will inevitably flow to those who are most willing and able to wield force without scruple. Yet, to dismiss him as a mere thug would be a catastrophic misreading of history. His true genius lay in his ability to bureaucratize brutality, to take the raw, disorganized criminality of the pre-war gangs and impose upon it a corporate structure, a chain of command, and a long-term strategic vision that transformed it into something far more powerful and insidious, a shadow government. He understood that sustainable power in the modern world required more than just fear. It required economic integration, political protection, and a legitimizing cultural narrative. And he pursued all three with a relentless, focused energy that few legitimate CEOs could ever hope to match. His reign stands as a stark lesson in the vulnerabilities of a rapidly modernizing democracy, demonstrating how easily political and economic systems can be corrupted from within by a sufficiently determined and immoral force. But the story of Kazuo Taoka is also a monumental lesson in the inherent limitations of power built on such a foundation. The very methods that enabled his rise, the cult of personality, the absolute demand for loyalty, the reliance on overwhelming violence, contained the poison that would eventually cripple his empire. A system that cannot tolerate dissent is a system that cannot correct its course, and a power structure that revolves entirely around one man is a structure destined to collapse when that man is gone. His life is a classic, almost Shakespearean, tragedy of overreach. The orphan who built a family of thousands could not connect with his own son. The emperor who commanded an army could not control the succession. The strategist who outmaneuvered rivals and police for decades could not outmaneuver the slow, impersonal forces of social change and legal evolution. The society that had once tolerated him eventually matured, wealthier, more secure, and less willing to abide a criminal state within the state. The final, perhaps most poignant, lesson of his life is that of the inescapable self. No amount of power, wealth, or fear could ever truly heal the wounded boy from Kagawa. The desperate need for an unshakable family created an organization that was, by its very criminal nature, inherently unstable. The search for absolute loyalty bred paranoia and eventual betrayal. The empire, for all its terrifying scale, was ultimately a fortress built on the fault line of his own childhood trauma. And it was only a matter of time before the tremors from that deep, unhealed rupture brought the entire structure down. Kazuo Taoka's story, therefore, is more than just the biography of a gangster. It is a cautionary tale about the nature of power, the price of ambition, and the enduring, often destructive, power of the past. He sought to conquer the world, to quiet the demons within, and in the end, the demons and the world both claimed their due. He remains an indelible part of Japan's modern history, a dark star whose gravitational pull shaped the orbits of politics, business, and culture for half a century. A formidable, tragic, and ultimately doomed figure whose legacy is a monument not to the glory of power, but to its profound and terrible costs. And so, the epic of Kazuo Taoka, the last emperor of the Yakuza, draws to its inevitable close, a saga that began in the silent despair of a forgotten child and culminated in the thunderous, albeit fleeting, command of a criminal empire that once held a nation in its thrall. We have journeyed together from the dusty roads of Kagawa to the bustling, neon-lit streets of post-war Kobe, through the brutal gang wars that cemented his power, into the corporate boardrooms and political backrooms where his influence silently festered, and finally, to the hospital room where the formidable will that had sustained it all finally flickered and died. We have witnessed the intricate machinery of his power, the calculated violence, the strategic alliances, the cultural manipulation, and we have also peered into the profound human cost, the countless silent tragedies that formed the dark, unspoken foundation of his legendary reign. His story is now complete, a chapter of history sealed, a testament to the fact that even the most imposing shadows are cast by a light that must, in time, be extinguished. The legacy he left behind is a complex and fractured one, a name that still evokes fear, but also serves as a cautionary monument to the limits of power built on fear itself. The Yamaguchi-gumi endures, but as a ghost of his creation, perpetually fighting the battles he began and fracturing under the strains he engineered. The world has moved on, constructing legal and social barriers to ensure that no single criminal figure can ever again amass such public, untouchable power. The story of Kazuo Taoka is now a tale told to understand the hidden currents of modern Japan, a dark mirror held up to a period of incredible transformation. But the purpose of this journey, this deep and detailed immersion into a hidden world, was never to glorify the violence or to sensationalize the crime. Our mission, as stated from the very beginning, was to present you with the most comprehensive and accurate account, pieced together from a mosaic of historical sources to educate and to inform. We sought to unravel the myth from the man, the corporate structure from the criminal acts, and the personal tragedy from the public terror. It is our sincere hope that this narrative has not only captivated you, but has also provided a deeper, more nuanced understanding of this fascinating and dark chapter in history. The journey of 1,000 miles ends here, but the pursuit of knowledge is a path that never truly ends. If this deep dive into the secret history of the 20th century's most powerful criminal syndicate has intrigued you, if it has sparked a desire to understand the other hidden forces that shape our world, then we invite you to continue this journey with us. The channel is a gateway to countless other untold stories, detailed investigations into forgotten histories, unsolved mysteries, and the complex figures who have lurked in the shadows of our world. We dedicate immense research and effort to bring you content that is not only engaging, but truly enlightening. So, if you want to join us in uncovering more truths, please show your support. Take a moment to like this video. It helps more curious minds like yours discover our work. subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next detailed exploration into the forgotten corners of history and crime. And most importantly, we value your thoughts. Share your reflections on this epic story of Kazuo Taoka in the comments below. What aspect of his rise and fall did you find most compelling? How do you view the legacy of such a figure? Your engagement is what fuels this journey of discovery. Thank you for your time, for your curiosity, and for listening. This has been the story of Kazuo Taoka. Until our next investigation into the shadows, stay informed, stay curious, and take care.